Clara's mornings had a quiet, heavy rhythm now, each one a reminder of what she had lost. The small farmhouse she inherited with her late husband stood at the edge of the county, surrounded by rolling fields that, in better times, had been a source of pride and modest comfort. But ever since his death, every creaking floorboard and every rustling of the wind through the trees seemed to echo her loneliness. At 28, Clara had been thrust into a world she had never anticipated, one in which every decision, every laborious task rested solely on her shoulders. Her husband's absence was a tangible void. She missed the way he had once taken the reins of the farm chores, with easy strength, his calm guidance smoothing over the small crises that now loomed over her like dark clouds. The farm was small, yet it demanded more than she could often give. Fences needed repairing, water had to be drawn from the old well, and the fields required constant attention, especially with winter approaching. Each day began before dawn and ended long after the sun had sunk behind the distant hills. Her hands were rough and calloused from the work she had never imagined doing alone, yet there was a quiet pride in the strength she was discovering in herself. Still, she couldn't ignore the shadow of fear that crept into her heart whenever she considered the mounting debts and the persistent threat of foreclosure. The bank had been patient, but their patience was not infinite, and Clara knew she needed a miracle, or at least a stroke of luck, to keep the land her husband had loved so dearly. Raising her 7-year-old daughter Emma added another layer of urgency and responsibility. Emma was a bright, curious child, but the girl's laughter, which should have been a balm to Clara's weary heart, sometimes reminded her of all she had lost. Clara often found herself torn between tending to the farm and spending quality time with Emma, and guilt settled on her chest like a heavy weight. Despite her exhaustion, she refused to let Emma see her despair. She had promised her late husband that their daughter would grow up strong, happy, and secure. Clara's determination to honor that promise often propelled her forward through the bleakest moments. Evenings were the hardest. With the chores done, she would sit on the porch, staring at the horizon where the sun painted the sky in streaks of pink and gold, feeling both the beauty of the world and the crushing solitude of it. She would think of her husband's easy smile, the plans they had made together, and the life that had been ripped away too soon. Her neighbors were kind, but they lived busy lives, and she was learning that some battles had to be fought alone. Still, Clara's resilience was growing. Each small victory, patching a fence, repairing a broken wheel, coaxing a stubborn cow into the barn, was a testament to her grit. She was slowly transforming grief into strength, loneliness into determination. Yet, even in her routine, Clara sensed that change was coming. The wind carried whispers of storms and the faint scent of rain, and sometimes she imagined that life itself had a way of bringing unexpected encounters to those brave enough to endure hardship. Little did she know that her courage, kindness, and perseverance were about to intersect with a stranger in a way that would alter the course of her life forever. The day had begun with a deceptively calm sky, the kind that made Clara almost forget the unpredictability of the county she called home. But by mid-afternoon, subtle changes began to ripple across the horizon. Dark, ominous clouds rolled in from the west, their underbellies bruised with shades of deep gray and purple. The wind, once a gentle companion, now whispered through the trees with an unsettling urgency, tugging at the edges of Clara's skirts and rattling the loose shutters of the farmhouse. Birds scattered in chaotic flocks, their calls shrill and anxious, and even the cows in the pasture pressed close together, their low moans vibrating through the crisp air. Clara paused in her work, wiping sweat from her brow, and studied the sky with a wary eye. Something about it felt dangerous, the kind of danger that had no mercy. She hurried through her chores with renewed urgency, fastening the barn doors, checking the fences, and gathering Emma indoors. Each task was tinged with a tension that made her heart pound, not just the fear of damage to the farm, but the very real threat to their lives. Clara knew the county's reputation for sudden storms, but there had been none quite like this in recent memory. Lightning began to arc across the sky, jagged streaks illuminating the looming clouds, followed by the deep rolling growl of thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. The air grew heavy and charged, clinging to her skin, making every movement a little more labored. She could feel the static in her hair, smell the sharp tang of ozone, and her gut nodded with a primal instinct. This was no ordinary storm. Emma clung to her mother's side, her small fingers wrapped around Clara's wrist, and Clara felt an acute mix of fear and determination. She whispered reassurances to her daughter, though her own heart thumped with uncertainty. They moved through the farmhouse, securing windows, stacking supplies, and making sure the lanterns and candles were within reach. The wind was now more insistent, tugging at the roof and shaking the walls. Clara's ears rang with the sound of trees bending violently, the cries of frightened animals, and the roar of the approaching storm. Each moment stretched unbearably, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios while trying to keep panic at bay. As she stepped outside to check the barn one last time, Clara caught sight of something or someone in the distance. A man appeared to be struggling through the wind and debris, moving toward the farm with difficulty. Her instincts flared. She should stay inside, keep Emma safe, and avoid drawing attention to herself. Yet another part of her, a part forged from years of resilience and empathy, compelled her to act. She gritted her teeth against the sting of driving rain and the whip of the wind, sprinting toward the stranger as the first hints of a funnel cloud began to twist in the distance. The tornado was forming faster than Clara had ever witnessed, a dark, menacing spiral that touched the horizon like a living shadow. She felt her pulse race, adrenaline flooding every vein, but she did not hesitate. Her eyes never left the man struggling against the storm. There was something urgent about his presence, something that made her forget, even for a moment, the fear coiling in her chest. She reached him just as the wind intensified, and together they staggered toward the barn, leaning into the storm's fury with every step. In that chaotic moment, Clara's courage crystallized. This was not just about survival. It was about acting when it mattered most, even in the face of raw elemental power. And as the tornado's roar filled the air around them, the seed of a life-changing encounter was planted, a bond that would grow stronger in the aftermath of the storm, and set Clara on a path she could never have anticipated. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing through the fields and tossing branches across Clara's path as she pushed forward to help the struggling man. He was hunched over, holding onto a wooden cart that threatened to tip with every gust. Rain pelted them both, soaking through clothes and stinging their faces, yet Clara's focus never wavered. Her instincts told her that despite the storm, she had to act, and quickly. With a determined step, she reached him and called out over the roar of the wind. "Hold on. I'll help you with that." She shouted, her voice barely audible, yet carrying the authority of someone who refused to let fear dictate her actions. The stranger looked up, momentarily startled. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, drenched hair plastered to his forehead, and a shadow of confusion crossed his features. There was something striking in his posture, a rugged strength, a sense of calm determination despite the chaos surrounding them. Clara sensed immediately that he was no ordinary man caught in the storm. There was a resilience about him that mirrored her own, a silent acknowledgement that some battles must be faced head-on. Working together, they managed to steady the cart. Clara's hands gripped the wetwood tightly, muscles straining as she braced against the wind. The man Luke, she would later learn, finally nodded in recognition of her help, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Though their words were few, the shared effort forged a subtle connection. In that instant, Clara realized that survival was not just about strength, but about trust, and she found herself instinctively relying on this stranger in a way that surprised her. He spoke then, his voice calm and measured, cutting through the storm. "We need to get inside. That tornado's not slowing down." There was no arrogance in his tone, only a quiet authority, as though he had faced danger before and knew exactly how to navigate it. Clara agreed, signaling her daughter to stay inside the farmhouse under the protective cover of the walls. The urgency of the situation left no room for hesitation. Every second mattered. Together they began the treacherous journey toward the barn, leaning into the wind, dodging falling branches, and shielding each other whenever debris threatened to strike. Along the way, they exchanged fleeting words, his name, hers, and terse comments about the storm, but there was an unspoken understanding forming between them. Clara observed the way he moved, the careful precision with which he protected himself and the cart, and the subtle way he seemed to respect her strength rather than dismiss it. There was a quiet tension, a mixture of admiration and curiosity that neither dared fully acknowledge in the middle of the storm. Yet in those brief moments, Clara felt something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of being seen, truly seen, by someone who wasn't bound by pity or judgment. When they finally reached the safety of the barn, both were breathless, soaked, and shivering, yet alive. Clara hurried to secure the doors against the relentless wind, and Luke, though equally drenched, moved with steady purpose, helping her stack hay bales and brace the structure. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized in the urgency of survival. In the barn's dim light, amidst the smell of hay, wet earth, and rain-soaked wood, Clara caught herself stealing glances at the stranger. Despite the chaos outside, there was a quiet intimacy in that shared struggle, a connection forged not through romance but through courage, compassion, and necessity. As the tornado raged beyond the walls, Clara realized that this chance encounter, this act of helping a stranger in the storm, was about more than survival. It was the beginning of a bond that would forever alter the course of her life. In that barn, soaked and exhausted, she sensed the faintest spark of hope, a possibility that even in the darkest of storms, unexpected blessings could appear in the form of a kind, strong, and enigmatic cowboy who had stumbled into her world. The barn smelled of damp hay, earth, and the lingering scent of animals, but inside, it was a sanctuary from the storm's relentless fury. Rain pelted the roof and wind rattled the wooden walls, but the space offered Clara and the stranger, Luke, a rare moment of reprieve. They collapsed near the stacked hay bales, both gasping for breath, clothes plastered to their bodies, hearts still hammering from the near brush with the tornado. Clara's fingers shook as she brushed wet hair from her forehead, and Luke, despite his rugged composure, was equally soaked and exhausted. For a moment, silence filled the space between them, broken only by the storm's roar outside. Clara was the first to speak, her voice soft but steady. "Are you okay?" she asked, glancing at him as he adjusted his hat, water dripping from its brim. Luke nodded, offering a small, tight-lipped smile. Yeah, thanks to you. I don't know what I'd have done out there without your help." His words were simple, but they carried weight. In that brief exchange, Clara sensed a depth of gratitude, honesty, and humility in him, qualities she hadn't expected to find in a stranger. As the wind battered the barn, Clara found herself studying him, noting the strength in his arms, the quiet intensity in his eyes, and the careful way he moved around the space, ensuring nothing would collapse under the storm's force. Despite the chaos, Luke maintained a calmness that was almost contagious, and slowly Clara felt her own racing heart begin to settle. She realized that amidst fear and danger, human connection, trust, even for a stranger, could bring a strange kind of comfort. Time passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. They shared stories in fragments, each word a small thread weaving a fragile tapestry of familiarity. Clara spoke of her farm, her late husband, and her daughter Emma, whose laughter and curiosity she longed to protect. Luke, in turn, spoke cautiously about the road he had traveled, hinting at a life of work on distant ranches, encounters with unpredictable weather, and the quiet solitude of a man who had often been his own company. He revealed little, yet in his guarded way, he allowed Clara glimpses into his character, resilient, observant, and deeply respectful of her independence. There was a rhythm to their interaction, born of necessity and survival. Clara fetched fresh hay for the horses, and Luke helped secure the barn's side doors, their actions complementing one another almost instinctively. In these small, cooperative efforts, Clara began to see him not merely as a stranger, but as someone she could trust, someone whose presence brought calm amid chaos. Their shared labor became a subtle dance, and in the way they communicated, through glances, gestures, and half-spoken sentence, an unspoken bond started to form. Outside, the tornado's roar gradually faded, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Clara leaned against a hay bale, feeling the tension in her muscles slowly ease. She realized that this moment stranded in a barn with a stranger, shaken yet alive, was oddly grounding. It reminded her of the unpredictability of life and the small mercies that often arrive disguised as chance encounters. Luke, too, seemed reflective, his eyes scanning the barn as if assessing what had survived the storm, yet softening whenever they met hers. By the time the storm fully passed, Clara understood that something significant had begun. The barn, once merely a place of work and storage, had become a haven not just from the storm, but from the isolation she had felt since her husband's death. In this shared refuge, two lives intersected in a way neither could have predicted, and the first seeds of trust, respect, and perhaps something more had been sown. Survival had forced proximity, but it also revealed character, courage, and the beginnings of a connection that would shape the days to come. When Clara finally stepped out of the barn, the world around her was unrecognizable. The storm had left a chaotic wake, tree limbs strewn across the fields, sections of fencing torn from their posts, and patches of her crops flattened by the wind's force. The sky, now a muted gray, still carried the weight of lingering clouds, as though the world itself was exhausted from the battle it had just endured. Clara's heart pounded not with fear this time, but with a mixture of awe and apprehension. She had survived the storm, but now came the task of facing its consequences. Luke stepped beside her, his boots sinking slightly into the churned-up earth. The cart he had struggled with during the tornado lay in ruins, splintered and waterlogged, yet he seemed oddly composed. There was no dramatization of loss in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgment of reality. Clara admired that composure. It contrasted sharply with the raw, frantic energy she had carried through the storm. Yet she couldn't ignore the twinge of worry that flickered in her chest. Her own farm had sustained damage, minor, but troubling, and she knew that recovery would be grueling without assistance. Together, they began assessing the damage. Clara walked through the flattened rows of her crops, noting which sections could still yield anything and which would require replanting. Each broken fence post and fallen branch told a story of the storm's ferocity. Luke helped where he could, lifting heavier debris and offering practical suggestions for immediate repairs. His presence was steadying. Where Clara's mind raced with the overwhelming list of tasks, he seemed to offer clarity, a reminder that methodical action could alleviate even the most daunting challenges. As they worked, a new dimension of their connection emerged. Luke's gratitude from the day before had evolved into genuine concern for Clara's welfare. He observed quietly, stepping in at critical moments, but never overshadowing her authority or independence. Clara, in turn, found herself appreciating not just his strength, but his respect for her capabilities. There was a delicate balance forming a partnership built not on romance or obligation, but on mutual acknowledgement and trust. The true measure of the storm's impact, however, came when they assessed the barn itself. Despite the ferocity outside, it had largely held. Minor damages needed repair, but it stood as a testament to careful planning and preparation. Luke remarked, almost casually, that barns and fences were only as strong as the hands that built and maintained them. A simple statement, yet one that resonated deeply with Clara. She realized that her own resilience, her tireless labor, had saved more than just physical property. It had preserved a sense of security and continuity for her daughter and herself. By the late afternoon, the storm had passed entirely. Birds cautiously returned to the fields, and the wind softened to a gentle whisper. Clara felt a tentative sense of relief wash over her, though exhaustion weighed heavily in her muscles. She glanced at Luke, who had been surveying the land with thoughtful eyes. The stranger she had helped, the man she had fought beside in the tornado, now seemed more than a passerby. He was a figure of unexpected stability in a world that had felt so fragile. Before leaving, Luke offered to help with the repairs over the coming days, though he did so without any hint of condescension. Clara accepted, recognizing both the practicality and the kindness behind his offer. It was in these small, everyday gestures, lifting debris, tying down loose boards, sharing the burden of work, that their bond deepened. What began as a chance meeting in the chaos of the storm was now evolving into something more tangible. Mutual respect, gratitude, and the subtle beginnings of admiration. As Clara finally returned to her farmhouse, calling Emma inside and allowing herself a moment of reprieve, she reflected on the day. The tornado had been a force of destruction, yet it had also brought Luke into her life. She couldn't foresee what the future held, but one thing was certain. This encounter had changed her, not just by saving her life in that moment, but by introducing someone who could walk beside her in the uncertain days ahead. And in that realization, a faint but persistent hope began to take root. The days following the tornado were filled with labor and quiet reflection. Clara and Luke spent long hours repairing fences, salvaging what they could from damaged crops, and reinforcing the barn against future storms. Their partnership, born out of necessity and courage, continued to grow stronger. Yet Clara still knew little about the man who had so effortlessly stepped into her life during the storm. He remained guarded in many ways, sharing just enough to be helpful, but keeping the depths of his life private. Clara, for her part, respected his reticence, though curiosity tugged at her every time she noticed the small hints of a life far more complex than hers. One afternoon, as they worked side by side along the edge of the farm, a neighbor passed by, tipping his hat politely at Luke. Clara, curious, asked the neighbor about him, expecting perhaps a simple introduction or a passing acquaintance. The neighbor paused, eyes widening slightly as he glanced at Luke. "You don't know?" he asked. "That's Luke Barrett. Owns nearly half the county, he does. Land, cattle, ranches, you name it." Clara blinked in disbelief. Her mind raced to process what she had just heard. The man who had appeared in her life as a stranded stranger in a tornado was not just a wandering cowboy or a helpful neighbor. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, someone whose reach extended far beyond the small farm she struggled to maintain. She felt a mix of astonishment, confusion, and something else she hadn't anticipated. A sudden awareness of how much this revelation could change her perception of him, and perhaps even herself. When Luke noticed her stunned expression, he tilted his head in quiet amusement. "You've heard?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. There was no pride or pretense in his tone, only the calm acknowledgment of a truth he had never needed to announce. Clara struggled to find words, torn between incredulity and the desire to remain composed. She had met few people in her life who commanded such quiet authority without needing to flaunt it, and Luke was one of them. As they continued working, Clara reflected on her own assumptions. She realized she had been viewing Luke purely through the lens of the tornado encounter, a rugged, brave stranger who had needed her help. But the reality was far more complicated. Luke was a man with influence, resources, and responsibilities that stretched across the county. And yet, despite all of that, he had chosen to help her not for gain, not for recognition, but because he saw someone in need. That realization brought a rush of unexpected emotion, gratitude, respect, and a subtle growing admiration. The revelation also stirred a sense of caution within Clara. She was fiercely independent and wary of being seen as a charity case. Luke's wealth could easily create a power imbalance, and she was determined not to let it undermine her dignity or the hard work she had put into her farm. Yet, even as these thoughts raced through her mind, she couldn't deny that Luke's presence, his support and quiet strength, was a gift she hadn't expected and couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, Luke continued to assist her, never imposing, never reminding her of his status, but using his knowledge and resources subtly to help the farm recover. He guided the repairs, offered strategic advice, and occasionally lent a hand with the heavier labor, all while maintaining a respectful distance. Clara's initial shock gave way to a growing trust. She realized that wealth and influence, when wielded with humility, could become a force for good, and that Luke's choice to remain grounded despite his status was one of the qualities that drew her to him even more. By the end of that week, Clara's perception of Luke had shifted profoundly. No longer just the stranger she had saved from the tornado, he was now a man of depth and integrity, someone whose kindness and courage had not been diminished by wealth, but perhaps even enhanced by it. The secret, once revealed, added a layer of complexity to their relationship, making Clara more aware of the possibilities and challenges that lay ahead. And in the quiet moments at the edge of her farm, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she began to. After learning the truth about Luke's vast holdings, Clara found herself navigating a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she admired him more than ever, his humility, despite wealth, and his unwavering willingness to help after the tornado had struck. On the other hand, she felt a prickling sense of unease, a subtle tension that she hadn't anticipated. She was a widow trying to maintain her farm and protect her daughter, and suddenly she was dealing with a man whose influence and resources dwarfed her own world. Clara prided herself on her independence, and the thought of relying too heavily on anyone, Even someone as admirable as Luke stirred a quiet resistance within her. Luke seemed acutely aware of the delicate balance between offering help and respecting Clara's autonomy. He never insisted on taking control or making decisions for her. Instead, he approached every situation with patience and subtle guidance, offering suggestions rather than commands. "The fences post there might hold better if we brace it like this," he would say, and then step back to allow her to make the final choice. At times, Clara felt a surge of gratitude, but at others, she felt the tension of pride battling practicality. Accepting help, even from someone she trusted, was not easy for her. Their partnership became a dance of compromise. Clara demonstrated resourcefulness and knowledge of her land, while Luke contributed experience, insight, and occasional labor. Both recognized that the farm's survival depended on cooperation, yet underlying it was a quiet negotiation of boundaries. Clara's independence was non-negotiable. Luke's generosity was deliberate yet unobtrusive. It was an intricate balance, requiring patience, respect, and an understanding that neither would dominate the other. As they worked together, their conversations began to reveal deeper aspects of their personalities. Luke admired Clara's tenacity, frequently remarking on her courage and resilience. "Most people would have given up after the storm," he said one evening, voice tinged with sincerity. "You kept going, even when it wasn't easy." Clara, in turn, recognized the steadiness in Luke, a reliability that went beyond wealth or social standing. He could face a tornado or negotiate with neighboring landowners with equal calm, yet he never made her feel small or dependent. These moments of acknowledgement and mutual respect laid the foundation for trust, but the disparity in social status remained an unspoken tension that occasionally colored their interactions. At times, Clara's pride clashed with the subtle reminders of Luke's influence. When he offered to secure materials or negotiate a better price from a neighboring rancher, she felt a flicker of hesitation. She didn't want to appear incapable or indebted. Yet, as she observed how he acted with humility and kindness, never condescension, she realized that accepting his help didn't diminish her strength. It complemented it. Slowly, she learned that partnerships could be balanced, that two strong, independent people could collaborate without one overshadowing the other. Despite the underlying tension, there were small moments of levity and connection that eased the unease. Sharing meals after long days, exchanging dry humor in the face of minor setbacks, and laughing at the chaos of their combined efforts allowed them to bond in ways that were deeper than words. The storm had brought them together, but it was their shared experiences, mutual respect, and quiet admiration for each other's strengths that made their partnership meaningful. By the end of this chapter in their lives, Clara understood that this uneasy partnership was more than just practical. It was the beginning of a relationship built on equality, trust, and integrity. Luke's presence was no longer just that of a benefactor or helper. He had become a companion, a steady hand in a world that could be unpredictable and harsh. And while Clara's pride remained intact, she had learned the value of opening her heart and her farm to someone whose intentions were honorable, even if the social divide between them lingered like a subtle, unspoken shadow. With the tornado behind them, Clara's life gradually began to stabilize, but the presence of Luke introduced a new layer to her world, one that extended beyond her farm and her immediate struggles. Luke, though initially quiet about his holdings, began subtly introducing Clara to the broader community. He didn't flaunt his wealth or influence. Instead, he offered gentle guidance, introducing her to neighbors who could provide materials, advice, or assistance in ways that respected her independence. Clara noticed that his reputation carried weight. People listened when he spoke, but he never used it to overshadow her accomplishments. Instead, he used it to create opportunities for her, bridging gaps she hadn't known existed. The first encounter was with old Mr. Hawkins, a retired rancher known for his stern demeanor and unwillingness to help outsiders. Luke suggested Clara ask him for advice on restoring a portion of her fence that had collapsed. At first, Clara felt uneasy. She didn't want to appear needy. But Luke's presence lent subtle credibility, and Mr. Hawkins's tone softened as he offered practical guidance. By the time she returned home, Clara realized something significant. She could accept support without feeling diminished, and community ties could be strengthened through collaboration, not reliance. Luke's influence continued to ripple through her life in small, meaningful ways. When neighbors came to check on the aftermath of the storm, they were impressed by Clara's resilience and the visible improvements she had already made. Luke quietly helped arrange for extra help with some heavier repairs, ensuring that Clara's efforts remained central while giving her access to additional resources. It was a delicate balance, but one that allowed Clara to shine in the eyes of her community while still receiving the support she needed. Through these interactions, Clara observed a subtle but profound change in how people regarded her. Where before she had been seen as a struggling widow managing her farm alone, she was now respected as a capable, resourceful woman who could confront challenges head-on. Luke's assistance had opened doors, but it was Clara's courage, intelligence, and determination that earned her the admiration of her neighbors. This realization bolstered her confidence and gradually eased the tension she had felt about accepting help from someone of Luke's stature. Meanwhile, Luke and Clara's partnership continued to deepen. They worked side by side in the fields, shared meals at the farmhouse, and discussed strategies for improving the farm's productivity. Conversations that once centered on survival and repairs now included dreams for the future better irrigation systems, stronger fencing, and even the possibility of expanding the farm's reach. Through these discussions, Clara realized that Luke respected her opinions, valued her insights, and genuinely sought her input. Their bond was no longer just about working together. It had evolved into a meeting of minds and hearts, grounded in mutual respect and trust. Emma, too, benefited from the strengthened community ties. Neighbors who had once been distant now offered small gestures of kindness, sharing seeds, offering tutoring, or simply welcoming her into their homes for occasional playdates. Clara watched her daughter flourish, feeling a sense of relief and joy that she hadn't experienced since before her husband's death. Luke's presence and the subtle network of support he helped facilitate created a safer, more nurturing environment for both mother and daughter. By the time the season fully changed and the threat of storms faded, Clara understood that she was no longer isolated. The tornado had brought Luke into her life, but it had also created an opportunity to weave herself into the fabric of the wider community. Trust, respect, and mutual admiration had replaced fear, uncertainty, and isolation. And as Clara looked out over her farm, she felt a quiet, hopeful sense of possibility, knowing that her resilience, combined with Luke's steadfast support and the community's recognition, had laid the foundation for a future richer than she had ever dared to imagine. Life on the farm had begun to regain a rhythm, and Clara allowed herself moments of cautious optimism. The crops were recovering, fences had been repaired, and Luke's quiet guidance had proven invaluable in ensuring the farm's sustainability. Yet, just as stability seemed within reach, a new crisis emerged: a rival landowner, a sudden market threat, or perhaps the county. Banks tightening their deadlines that threatened to undo the progress she had fought so hard to achieve. This challenge was different from the tornado. It was slower, insidious, and required not only physical effort, but careful judgment and negotiation. Clara felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach as she reviewed the implications of this new threat. Alone, she knew she would have to fight tooth and nail, possibly sacrificing time and energy she could ill afford. But Luke, ever attentive, observed her mounting worry with quiet patience. He didn't rush in to solve the problem for her. Instead, he offered counsel, strategies, and subtle support that respected her authority while bolstering her confidence. "We can handle this together," he said one evening, his voice low but steady. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any grand gesture. It acknowledged her independence while extending partnership, trust, and reassurance. The ensuing days were tense. Clara and Luke faced the challenge side by side, negotiating with local officials, organizing repairs, and navigating the complex social dynamics of the county. In moments of exhaustion, their mutual reliance became evident. Luke's calm presence helped steady Clara when doubts threatened to overwhelm her, and Clara's determination inspired Luke to trust in her judgment and resilience. It was during one particular long day when the sun had dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields that the emotional weight of their partnership became impossible to ignore. As they paused to catch their breath, Clara turned to Luke, her hands trembling from both exertion and suppressed emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she admitted quietly. There was no expectation of reciprocity, only honesty, and the raw vulnerability in her words created a fragile intimacy between them. Luke, for the first time in full candor, responded not with practical advice or reassurances, but with confession. "I admired you from the moment I saw you out there in the storm," he said, voice steady yet intimate. "Your courage, your strength. I've never met anyone like you. And I've been wanting to tell you, but I didn't know how." The revelation stunned Clara not because she hadn't noticed the quiet attention he paid her, but because hearing it aloud made it real. For the first time, the barrier of pride, independence, and social awareness seemed to melt away. She realized that the admiration and respect they had shared in their labor, their conversations, and their small victories had blossomed into something deeper. Mutual affection, tempered by trust and grounded in shared experience. Clara found her voice, her confession emerging almost simultaneously. I feel the same way," she admitted, her eyes meeting his. "But I've been afraid. Afraid of what it might mean, or how it would change things between us." The honesty between them was a revelation, a moment of emotional clarity that both had been silently craving but hesitant to articulate. In that quiet evening, as the golden light of sunset spilled across the fields and the crisis that had threatened to overwhelm them began to ease, Clara and Luke acknowledged what had been growing between them. Their bond, forged in adversity and strengthened by mutual respect and shared struggle, had now taken on an emotional depth neither could ignore. The crisis had tested their resilience, their judgment, and their trust, but it had also given them permission to recognize and embrace the feelings that had been quietly developing from the moment they met. By the end of that day, Clara understood that the challenges of life, both natural and human-made, had not only strengthened her independence, but had also prepared her to accept the companionship and affection of someone who truly respected her. And Luke, having voiced what he felt, had created a space for them both to envision a future together, grounded in partnership, courage, and love. The days after the crisis passed brought a renewed sense of stability and possibility. Clara's farm, once on the brink of ruin, was now thriving. Repairs were complete, crops showed promise, and the fences stood strong against future storms. Her hard work, determination, and willingness to accept guidance from Luke had transformed the property into a resilient homestead capable of weathering both natural disasters and financial strain. The tangible results of her labor filled her with pride, but it was the intangible, the confidence, hope, and trust she had gained that marked the real triumph. Luke's presence in her life had shifted from that of a mysterious stranger to a steadfast partner. He continued to offer support, yet never in a way that undermined her independence. Their relationship had evolved naturally, moving from mutual respect and shared labor to emotional intimacy and love. The confessions they exchanged during the recent crisis had removed the unspoken barriers that pride and fear had built, and now their connection was both comforting and invigorating. Clara realized that partnership, in its truest form, was not about dominance or dependence, but about collaboration, trust, and shared dreams. Emma thrived in this new environment. The young girl, once cautious and quiet in the aftermath of her father's death, now laughed freely, exploring the fields with curiosity and joy. She had come to admire Luke as a steady figure in her life, a mentor and friend who respected both her independence and her mother's authority. Clara watched their interactions with a sense of relief and contentment. She had always wanted Emma to grow up strong, secure, and loved, and now that vision was taking tangible shape. The stability of the farm, coupled with Luke's presence, offered a foundation upon which they could all build a fulfilling future. The community, too, recognized Clara's perseverance. Neighbors admired how she had weathered the tornado and subsequent challenges with courage and grace. Luke's support, combined with her own efforts, enhanced her standing in the county, not as a woman who needed saving, but as one whose intelligence, strength, and resilience commanded respect. This recognition was satisfying in itself, affirming that the choices she had made, both to accept help when necessary and to assert her independence, had been the right ones. Amid the daily rhythm of work and life, Clara and Luke found quiet moments to envision the future together. They spoke of expanding the farm, improving irrigation, raising healthier livestock, and perhaps even opening opportunities for others in the community. Every plan, every decision, was a joint effort, blending Clara's intimate knowledge of her land with Luke's experience and resources. Their collaboration symbolized the merging of two worlds, her resilience and determination meeting his strength and influence, creating a partnership that was both equal and enduring. Yet beyond the practical and emotional growth, it was the small, intimate moments that made hope tangible. Shared meals at the farmhouse, evenings spent watching the sun dip behind the hills, and the occasional quiet laughter over a minor mishap in the barn created a rhythm of life rich with connection. Clara realized that happiness was not merely survival, but the capacity to share life with someone who respected and cherished her. Luke, in turn, had found a kindred spirit whose courage and independence matched his own, and who could inspire and challenge him in equal measure. As the season shifted, bringing warmth, growth, and renewal, Clara stood on her porch, watching the fields ripple in the gentle breeze. Emma played nearby, and Luke worked on repairs to an outbuilding, occasionally glancing up with a smile. The farm was safe, her family secure, and the bonds she had formed were strong. The trials of the past, the tornado, financial struggles, and social uncertainties had all shaped this moment, imbuing it with a sense of hard-earned fulfillment. Clara understood that life would still bring challenges, but now she faced them with resilience, wisdom, and love. Her journey from grief and struggle to hope and new beginnings had been arduous, yet transformative. The storm had tested her strength, introduced unexpected connections, and ultimately led to a life richer than she had dared to imagine. Standing on the porch, heart full and eyes bright, Clara embraced the future, knowing that together, she and Luke, with Emma at their side, could weather any storm, literal or figurative, and thrive in the life they were building together.